Just waiting for Jess to give me the thumbs up so I can start the video.
Yeah.
Hey guys, this is Kevin Kane with Precision Powerlifting Systems. Next week I'm gonna, there's Jess. Next week I'm gonna get into so I was talking about the general principles, the progressive overload part, but I actually think that this conversation first is gonna help with that. And in the progressive overload part, I'm gonna talk about our recommended volumes and intensities and where that stuff comes from, and a little bit about like the Russian system and their research and why those numbers are important and all of that stuff. But today what I kind of want to discuss is long-term athletic development, or lack thereof, in American sports culture in general, I think, but American lifting culture for sure. This is something as a coach that I tend to really struggle with balancing. So there are ways that you can program that's almost like a sprint to get high levels of progress really quickly. And then there's other ways, like if you want to build champions, there's going to be a long-term focus to building a champion. Now, when you think about it, I guess from a realistic point of view, how many people are truly going to become champions at the end of the day? And I'm talking like recognized on a lifting platform as a world champion, national champion, whatever the level may be, right? Probably not a ton. So what I think culturally what we want is we want that progress and we want it all now and we want it fast. And so when you're selling shit, right? So when you're a coach and you're selling programming or you're selling coaching, a big part of selling the programs and the coaching becomes how quick you've got progress. So you get a new client, they start working with you, and they put 20 kilos on their total in 6 months. And in 6 months, this person's working with me, they put 20 kilos on their total. That becomes your marketing strategy. Now, for me, when I choose to have other coaches in my network, I wanted to talk to coaches who've built people from the ground up. So it's like one big reason why I wanted to work with Shaco is because Russia has a long-term athletic development program. He had done this for a long period of time, and he had built world record holders and world champions. I think Jeremy Hartman's a good example of an American coach who does the same thing. He got a lot of these kids when they were teenagers, built them from PVC pipes up into competing at a world level as juniors in the open class. Shelby won the Pro American at the Arnold this year. Louis Simmons took 15 people from his neighborhood and made them world champions. That these were lifters that didn't have experience lifting. Like, to me, those are the examples that I really want to concentrate on, because I think that's the most important aspect. Powerlifting is a sport that we can do for our entire lives. Like, this is something you can do well into later years. But in order to do that, you need to set yourself up right. And I think what we get into is we get into this commercialized product of powerlifting coaching and programming and all of this stuff. And what we're left with is this rush to get strong really fast. So there's a problem in American lifting because a lot of the lifters are only around for short periods of time. They come and go within a 5-year period. You don't really get the sustained level of competitiveness within the American powerlifting culture. It's this quick spike, fast fall off, then they're out of the sport. And I think there's a number of things that lead to that stuff happening, but as a coach, how much of this do we balance? How much do we balance of the sprint to the progress and actual like long-term development pieces? And for me personally, I'd struggled with this for years, because it's like, oh, well, if I try to push steady incremental progress, people get pissed that they're not progressing fast enough. So then I lose them and they go to a different coach. And then if I push too hard, too fast, people get a little bit banged up, but they see great progress. But I know inevitably at some point that progress is going to stop. And I think what you see happen in powerlifting is people sprint. They go to one program and they sprint to get the results from that one program. It stops happening and they hit a wall. And then they choose that, oh, this high intensity program's not for me. I'm going to try a high volume program. And now they just do a Smolov type of thing, and they see great progress and they're like, and then it stops and it's like, oh, maybe high volume's not good for me. Maybe I need to do this a little bit differently. And then they go to another program, and each of these programs kind of address these different needs in different spots. And what we really need is we need a culture that focuses on long-term athletic development, that puts lifters in the best position to progress over time. One of the things that, and like, I have just been on a tear with this stuff, because any conversation I've ever had with the people who I had mentioned before, okay? So like, Louis literally has a tattoo on the back of his neck that represents technical mastery. Shaco told me that technique is the most important aspect of training. The way that Hartman brings up those teenagers, it's a hard focus on technique, making sure you're in good positions, and then they start loading it. Like, to me, technique is extremely important, but when you go around with these programs, what you end up seeing is you see these technical heuristics that as long as you're lifting within the rules of competition, it's fine and everything will kind of take care of itself. If you're paying good money for coaching like that, that's not coaching. That is literally just an Excel spreadsheet. And, you know, I've gotten shit for saying this, but I think American research on the strength sports absolutely is fucking trash. I literally had somebody share with me an article that had 10 competitive weightlifters, and this was about variability of movements. 10 competitive weightlifters that averaged 26 years old, they weighed 200 pounds and they squatted 363 pounds. I don't give a fuck what 200-pound men who squat 363 pounds do. To me, that doesn't fucking matter. But the Russians actually had decades of research looking at athletes of all different levels, on drugs, not on drugs, and they literally put all of this data together. They collected a massive amount of data and pumped out this information that's like, here's the best way to structure things in a long-term manner to provide the best level of results. And maybe not everybody's going to be a champion, but we don't know who could be and who couldn't be, who's going to be around long enough, who wants to do it. Like, our job as coaches is to set the groundwork so that they can achieve those things that they want to do. And even if they're not going to be a champion, if we have a focus on a process that teaches them discipline, patience, commitment, perseverance, like if we have effort, consistency and effort, if we have a program that does this, we're going to build not only strong lifters, but lifters that are strong outside of the sport. There's a lot of life lessons that can be carried on into that when we focus on those other factors. I think, you know, for me as a coach at this point, and I've gone back and forth on this, but I am hard set on making sure I'm going to set people up for the highest level of success that they can possibly achieve. And when it comes to, you know, self-organizing seems to be a trendy word in the, you know, physical therapy and strength training worlds. And I use it quite a bit, and I do think it is really important. And that those things happen. But that doesn't mean that, oh, well, this is how they lift best. So if we focus on doing the program like this and our volumes and intensities and we just manipulate those, they'll self-organize in the technique that works best for them. The human body is not that smart in terms of adaptation for the highest level of performance output. It needs to be nudged by a coach. Technique matters. So when the Russians did all of this research over decades and decades, what they realized was you can only put so much strength on your body. You can only put so much muscle mass on your body. But the one thing that can always be improved and always be strived to do better is to move better. So manipulating the range of motion, manipulating your leverages as much as humanly possible so that you're using the largest, biggest muscles. You're using the elastic properties of those larger, bigger muscles. You're decreasing the range of motion in those lifts. And then you continuously train it over a period of time. They found that you can always improve movement, but you can't always improve muscle mass and you can't always improve strength output. So movement does matter for long-term success. But when you look at American research, everything's done in 12 to 16 weeks. So you take a bunch of not so strong people, you put them into a program that's an absolute new stimulus for them, and they show results. That's great, but that's 3 to 4 months. That Russian research was done over periods of Olympic preparation. So 4 and 8 year periods of time, they actually analyzed this data and constructed these training principles, and that's who they were analyzing. We're Olympic level athletes. They did it to astronauts. They did it to soldiers. We're doing it to 200-pound men who can't even squat 4 plates. To me, there's a big difference in that development. So when we're looking at long-term athletic development, technique absolutely matters. We want to be setting people up so that we're adjusting the range of motion to best accommodate their strength, to use larger, bigger muscles, and it won't just take care of itself if you just focus on volumes and intensities. So what ends up happening is, because we focus so much on volume and intensities in American powerlifting, we get higher frequency, higher volume programs that tend to be the norm around here. And it's just you're throwing a bunch of stimulus at a person and they see results for it for a period of time, but the results tend to be unstable. They tend to not be consistent over time, and I do think this is a problem with why you see so many lifters that end up washing out of the sport in 5 years or less, is because they're not being set up with that success. And that's not even just with technique, but it's also with a mindset. I think what ends up happening is, right, so Raw Lifting didn't really jump onto the scene big until 2013. So American sports, we have a lot of people, and we have a lot of people that play sports from the time that they're very young till high school, college, and beyond. So what you get is you get some people who have a lot of experience playing these sports that help them develop some levels of strength and some levels of power, and obviously some levels of body composition, that the first time that they lift weights, probably mixed with good leverages to lift weights, they lift a high amount of weight that first time. And so then you throw a bunch of volume and intensities and you start manipulating those factors. They have a very high level that they're starting with. A few years later, they're competing at an international level. So they've gone from doing no lifting of weights to within 3 years competing at an international level. And then you look at them and you're like, oh, well, their technique's not great, so it mustn't matter that much. And they become that reason why the technique doesn't matter. But it's like their starting level was just way higher than the majority of people that are involved in this sport. And those people just don't last very long. So they get into these positions where they start high, they're able to get those beginner gains and be competitive at an international level. Now with the poor technique, I think what you're just seeing is these strength and power levels being with good leverages being demonstrated underneath a barbell without good technique, because they don't need it. They're just showing you their strength and power. And then when you look at like Eastern European countries, their lifters don't even look like they break a sweat on the platform. Their third attempts look like their openers. Everything's the same speed. The technique looks the same from rep to rep to rep. And their technical mastery is very, very high. Where here's ours is very low, but we have a lot of brute strength, probably because of the way that they're developed over time. So American athletes might do football or gymnastics or hockey or basketball, or basketball players probably typically don't have the leverages to be very good the first time that they actually partake in a barbell sport. But we have these wrestling, like we have these sports that generate some levels of strength and power that when they finally do get underneath a barbell, they don't have the technical mastery to be underneath the barbell because they haven't done it in their lives, but they've done things that allow them to develop strength and power and coordination. And then you match that with good leverages underneath the barbell, and they're moving massive amounts of weight. So our powerlifting athletic development program is basically a crapshoot of where you came from when you were younger based off of your leverages. Where in Russia, they start at young ages. So from 8 to 10 years, when they're even under 8 years old, every kid does gymnastics, that's part of it. And then between 8 and 10, they start grabbing a PVC pipe, learning the mechanics of the lifts, but they're basically just doing a lot of GPP stuff, box jumps and pushing prowlers and all different ranges of motion and planes of movement. All of that stuff is addressed. And then as they age, they start placing a barbell on their back. The GPP slowly starts decreasing while the SPP starts increasing a little bit more. So by the time they're in their early 20s, a lot of them have about 10 years underneath the barbell. So they've developed that technical mastery to be very good in the sport. Where here, ours is just whatever sports you played kind of get thrown into you as a person, your anatomical structure you get underneath the barbell, and you're either good or you're not good when you start. So like for me, I weighed around 170 pounds when I first started powerlifting. I couldn't even squat 300 pounds. So I had a very low level baseline of strength underneath a barbell. I don't necessarily have the best leverages to be lifting. I sure as shit at 5'11" in that body weight didn't have the best leverages to be lifting. But you get somebody else who has the same body weight as me, around 170 pounds, but maybe they're 5'5", and maybe they have some different experiences growing up in sports and some different genetic abilities, and they get underneath the barbell, and I'm squatting under 300 pounds, but the first time they lift, they're squatting in the 400s or close to 500 pounds. And like that person over the next 3 years tends to be one that is very competitive at a national and international level, even though they didn't have that long-term athletic development in the barbell sport. And then it becomes an example that we use as coaches and lifters to justify that technique doesn't matter that much, that daily undulated periodization is the only way to get strong and all other methods are outdated. That stuff is just not true. There's the majority of people who come into this sport aren't going to have that high level of success, especially right off the bat. Most world records and champions are going to take years and years and years to build. And this gets even more true the more popular the sport gets. So one of the things that's really important is that we build that strong foundation of technique, of mindset, and of incremental progress over time for more stable results so that we can get that long-term success that we're looking for. To say technique doesn't matter and you're going to self-organize into something that, you know, now you're strong in these angles, but over time you're going to be strong in these ones. If you're not training those other angles, how the fuck are you going to ever change your angles? It's just not going to work that way. It's the coach's job to organize training in a way that nudges it to a position that the lifter is going to have the highest levels of success over the course of a career, not in the next 6 months. And American powerlifting in general, if you compete twice a year, you just look at it through these 6-month windows at a time. And if you're not seeing the progress that you think that you should be seeing in that period of time, you're kicking fucking rocks and hanging your head. Over the course of a year, if you take somebody who, let's say, I'm going to use a lifter that's competing this Saturday. She has about a 430 kilo total at 67.5 kilos body weight. If we put 10 to 15 kilos a year on her total in the next 5 years, she's literally going to be totaling 480 to 505 kilos at that time. That's almost an 1,100 pound total at 67.5 kilos body weight. Like that amount of progress, and it doesn't seem like a lot. Oh, 10 kilos on my total each year. Doesn't seem like a lot. That is a lot when you start adding up those numbers over time. And the body just, for some reason, the small incremental increases are more stable. Like those results just tend to be a lot more stable than when we make a big jump. So like 2 examples for me, I've benched 380 and 615 and deadlifted 615. I've done each of those 1 time in the gym and have never done it since. Like because those are such large jumps and I wasn't focusing on that incremental progress. I mean, I was having fun and just doing my thing in the gym, but those numbers aren't stable. I've never been able to reproduce those results again because I wasn't focusing on doing that. And that's where like the volumes and making sure, and this is why like I am a huge proponent of using percents to dictate training intensities and not RPEs. Because if your feelings are dictating what load to go on the bar, those weights never get to stabilize. Sometimes training should be hard. Sometimes training should be moderately hard. And sometimes training should be easy. And it shouldn't always just be where you feel it should be on a given day based off of your subjective feelings. That's a terrible way to run an overall program for long-term athletic development. In Russia, they literally don't care about your feelings because the coaches have a very high level of understanding load distribution, and they'll put days that are stimulating for adaptation, days that allow for maintenance, and days that allow for recovery. There's your high, medium, and low, and they disperse them through a training program appropriately based off of each lifter and based off of each lifter's well-being. So, you know, of course, what works best is you get a nice blend of higher intensity stuff, lower intensity stuff, and everything else, right? But there's a reason why the majority of that training volume needs to be between 70 and 85%. They have found over decades of research that this is really important. So about 2/3 of their volume fall within those intensity lines. So if you start using RPEs to dictate training and you know, you're taking those internal measures, and that could just be, you know, you drank a little extra caffeine so your perceived effort goes down. Maybe you took some ibuprofen because you were a little bit sore, that makes your perceived effort go down. Maybe the music you're listening to adjusts your perceived effort. There's not this ability to stabilize those results in the gym because your subjective feelings that are so variable based off of so much outside influence are dictating what loads are put on the bar. And I understand there are a lot of coaches that have had high levels of success utilizing those internal measures to dictate loads, but I am just not a fan of doing that. I like using those internal measures to give me feedback on how easy or how hard something is. So that over time I can see if 75% for triples is getting easier or whatever we're doing on that sheet of paper. I want to see them making progress at those weights and seeing those weights stabilize at those given RPEs so that I know when to advance the training appropriately. It's a step loading strategy that the Russians use with high levels of success. So one of the other things that like Americans like to do a lot is volumes and intensities have this inverse relationship where volumes go up, intensities go down. In Russia, they don't do that. There's levels of volume, right? It'll have those stimulating days, those maintenance days, and those recovery days, but average intensities across the board stay the same. So coming into a competition with Sheiko, my volume would drop to basically a minimum effective dose to maintain certain levels of strength, but average intensity would stay the same. So at the lower volumes, that means our top sets tend to be a little bit heavier, but average intensities literally across the board would be the exact same. It's always 70% plus or minus 2%. So there's this process of, and I say this a lot in my posts, where you allow the weights to mature and ripen before you allow them to grow. So just because one day, let's say the first day you come in, we're doing 75% for 5 triples, right? And it's like, wow, that was hard today. It could be pause squats, whatever the fuck you're doing. And it's hard that day, right? And if you're adjusting this based off of RPEs, maybe you drop 5% because it feels hard that day and you want it to be an RPE. Then the next week you come in, and let's say you have the same thing on there. And it's like, oh, all right, this feels better. So now you do the 75%, and now it's the same RPE that it was the last week. And then the next week you come in, and it's hard again, so you drop the weight. Now, what we need it to be 75% 5x3. Then the next week we do the same thing. Then the next week we do the same thing. And I want to see a trend happen. I want to see those RPEs drop. You need to get used to that weight. So anytime when you use a step loading program, for me, when I was with Shaco, I hit new maxes. That first 3 to 4 week period of using those new maxes with those percentages was fucking brutal. But then it gets easier. So it starts hard, then it becomes moderate, then it becomes easy, then you test and you get new maxes. And then you repeat the process again. So sometimes it should be hard. It's going to be a stimulating piece to it. But as a coach, that's feedback for me to know how our progress is going over a period of time. So one of the other things that the Russians found in their research is that the rep ranges should be 1/3 to 1/2 the maximum. So let's say at 75% you could do 10 reps. So if you take half of that, that's 5. A third of it's about 3. So between 3 and 5 reps is basically what the rep scheme should be at that intensity. Why does this work? They don't know. It just did. And it worked across the board for Olympic level athletes, for all level athletes, because they actually were keeping data for the ones that weren't even in the Olympic training centers. But so it works for this wide level of athletes, and it's probably just, it's enough of a stimulus to drive adaptation, but it's not so much that it's beating the lifter up. So it's allowing them to make slow, steady progress while not getting too beat up over time. So these things are really important to keep in mind because they looked at this data for Olympic trial periods, like I was saying, for 4-year periods, 8-year periods. So they had decades of research with this. When you look at our research, it's for 12 weeks, 16 weeks. To me, okay, great. And when you look at a lot of the protocols, it's like, okay, they were able to do this for 12 weeks. How would they be able to sustain some of these intensities for longer periods of time? It's just not going to work. So, to recap, long-term athletic development is not a thing in American powerlifting, but it needs to be. When people come into the sport, they need to be giving guidance on how to set themselves up for long-term success, because this is a sport that you can do long-term. I don't care if you're starting this sport in your 30s. Louis Simmons squatted over 900 pounds in his mid-50s. You can literally do things into this sport. Dave Ricks is still competing at a high level in competitive nationally in the open at 58, 59 years old, whatever he is nowadays. Tony Harris squatted 1,000 pounds at 50 years old. You have all of these older lifters that are capable of hitting all-time life PRs at those ages. So even if you're getting started in this sport at a later age, you need to be setting yourself up for long-term future success. Because if you're 30, you're gonna live to your 50, that's still 20 years. Technique absolutely fucking matters. And it is the baseline of any long-term athletic development program. And, it's manipulating the range of motion. So if I'm squatting close and my knees are driving forward hard, the range of motion for that squat is way more than if I spread my feet. Okay, so here's a quick biomechanics lesson. If I have a box that's right here and I'm squatting with a close stance, there's the distance. If I widen my stance, look at the difference in the range of motion. I mean, obviously this isn't drawn to scale for a squat, but there's a big difference. And then if you get horizontal pressure in your feet because of what it does at the hip joint, it even shortens it a little bit more. So why wouldn't you, if your range of motion is 16 inches when it's like this, but 6 inches if you go wider, why wouldn't you manipulate that range of motion to best suit, to lift a smaller distance? At the end of the day, strength is force times distance. So if we can shorten the distance, we can be stronger just by doing that alone. why wouldn't we want to use our glutes and our hamstrings and our adductors to eccentrically load and then build explosive power and strength using larger, bigger muscle groups with greater leverage at the bottom of a squat? If you just drive your knees forward to initiate the squat, you're only eccentrically loading your quads. Your quads are never going to lift as much as all of those muscles combined. But people tend to be stronger in those positions earlier on because that's how every fucking beginner squats. And like I was saying before, because of certain life experiences that someone may have, they may get underneath the barbell and have a high level of success doing it that way. That doesn't make it right. And for every one person that has success doing it that way, there's going to be hundreds that don't. And your ceiling, even if you are doing it that way, is going to be lower. So even if you're competitive at the world level, there are going to be people that are going to be on your heels eventually. And if you don't manipulate those leverages and those ranges of motion and start using larger muscle groups and working on those weak areas, people are just going to pass you. And I think that's what you see happen, is people have this success for 5 years in this sport, and then they just don't know what to do from that point. It gets frustrating and they quit. And if we had a long-term athletic development program here for lifting, and people bought into a longer-term athletic development plan for lifting, I think they would have less frustrations, they'd see more continued success, they'd see less injuries, and they'd see better overall performance. But we want everything so fast, so quickly. And in terms of progress, everybody wants that 30 kilo total PR in 6 months, but maybe it's better you get 5 kilos at a time every 6 months, right? So you're putting 10 to 15 kilos on your total a year, maybe even less. As you get more advanced, it's going to be less. It's about having stable numbers that are reproducible, that we can go into the gym and we can work with those stable numbers and we can get better with those numbers, challenge the body enough with the volumes and intensities and the work that we're doing, hit new maxes, but not huge ones that are right there that allow us to continue to use stable numbers to train with again. You see less frustrations, you see more continued progress. There was a reason why for 3 years I never not hit a total PR at a meet with Sheiko. It was because he understood how to manipulate those training volumes, those training loads, so that I had enough stimulation for adaptation and I had enough recovery so that I wasn't getting banged up and I could continue to progress over time with a strong focus on technique. So the Russians had found you can only build so much strength through motor unit firing and all of that stuff. You can only build so much muscle mass. But the one thing, because of the principle of dynamic organization, that's what these research studies are showing when it shows a lot of variability between movements between each individual from rep to rep and also between individual and individual, is because the body's always learning for better ways to perform a movement. The coach can nudge that process. So if we have this idea of what technique should look like by manipulating range of motion, by using larger, stronger muscles, and learning to be explosive and build the elastic capabilities of those muscles, we can manipulate those leverages and we can continue to manipulate those leverages over time so that we can lift more weight. It's not necessarily about being the strongest, it's about who can lift the most weight under the rules of competition. And to me, it just makes a lot more sense if this is a 16-inch range of motion, this is a 6-inch range of motion, I can probably train this 6-inch one a hell of a lot fucking more and a hell of a lot harder, because it's not as much work at the end of the day, right? Because work is literally force times distance over time. So when that distance becomes a variable and you can manipulate it, it really makes a difference. If we have those elastic capabilities of more muscles, we can put more force into the barbell, we can get stronger. Like these things, your body's not just gonna find the most optimal way to move. If you're moving like a beginner and you're just loading those beginner movement patterns, but because they're squatting to depth and they're locking out a deadlift and they're pausing on their chest on a bench and locking it out, doesn't mean it's right. Even if they're stronger in those angles, it might require that lifter taking a step back so they can have continued progress and stay healthy over the longer period of time. And that's something that I think Russian lifters have, and probably other cultures, is they have that patience and that understanding that it's a long-term process to get to be a championship level lifter. But here in America, coaching's a sales business. I can sell you on a 20 kilo total PR in 6 months, and I think, and I was saying this before, that you get these companies that have a high volume of lifters, they get a 20 kilo total PR in 6 months, they advertise it on their Instagram, they get a new wave of people, that other wave falls off because they're not seeing progress anymore, and then the next one comes in. And they get enough people in front of them that they get a freak or two, and it's going to be, that program's going to matter, and then that freak or two doesn't have good technique, and shows that technique doesn't matter, and it just becomes this continual process of American powerlifting is very strong in the IPF raw divisions. We don't do that great in equipped. And when you look in the other federations where there's drugs and everything else involved, it's much more competitive. So like we have this very like this dominance in this very niche area, but it doesn't necessarily mean everything we're doing is set up for the masses. It's not. We're getting a lot more people into the sports. You're getting a lot more freaks. They're putting up bigger numbers. They're competitive in a short period of time. They necessarily don't have the best technique. Most of them don't have terrible technique, but some of them just don't have very good technique, but they have a lot of brute strength. And at some point, if they don't fix that technical piece, this is what the Russians found, and I'm going to keep repeating this because it's really important to understand. You can only build so much motor unit firing and all the other components of strength, and you can only build so much muscle mass. The only thing that's left on top of those two things is to be more efficient in your movement, to spend less energy per repetition so that you can train more, you can do some other things, you can free up more motor units to push those heavier weights. Those are the things that matter. So if you don't think technique matters and it's just going to self-organize and take care of itself, you're missing the mark, and that's nothing more than short-term sightedness. Now, for me as a coach, I'm going to do the things that I think are right long-term to develop lifters. You know, as Trolls pointed out in a Facebook post, I'm a fucking nobody, so I don't get those freaks coming to me to do my program that I can advertise on Instagram to be like, hey, look, my program works because I took this fucking person who already has huge numbers and I just shoved them on a post. If I didn't develop that, so the group that I have now, a lot of them started with me. They did their first meets with me. They started from the empty bar, and we've had very good success. And that's something that, you know, gets overlooked because we're not winning national championships. We're not, you know, I've had a few people compete at the Arnold, which is technically an international competition, but we just don't have those big name lifters in this group. But we have people who started doing it the right way, and now that I've been around for 6 years, lifters are starting to see good success with it. And it's only a matter of time, if we continue to do things right, that success is going to continue. But it requires a commitment from each lifter, not just for a 6-month period of time, but understand that progress is going to move slow. It's going to be steady. Technique's going to matter. It doesn't mean we just lift 50% so that it looks good. The majority of the volume needs to be within that 70 to 85% range, which means we have to find a way to use those weights, but to also correct technical inefficiencies. That's our job as a coach. And for me, that's where the dynamic systems theory constraints-led approach comes in. It's, I have to use these weights, so I have to put you into positions that somehow are going to disallow you from using those inefficient techniques and encourage you only to use those more efficient technical pieces. At the same time, we got to train the psychology of the lifter. That's why max effort lifts are part of our programs and it wasn't part of Shako's. You know, the difference between my lifters and the Russian lifters, where by the time they got to Shako, they had over 10 years of experience in the sport, competing 4 to 6 times a year. So they've done so many competitions that lifting a heavy single is just not, it's not scary to them. But when I have a lifter that's been lifting for a year or two and they haven't taken many heavy singles or that experience, that anxiety and that psychological aspect of it becomes a major piece that we need to train in order to improve a competitive skill. So I'm going to do a video for Patreon only that I'm going to cover the heuristics of the training volumes and stuff and go over like exact numbers of the stuff that we're looking for, average intensities, number of lifts, and how I started manipulating it throughout the weeks, which I kind of was doing. I just needed to do a better job of the average intensities in there, so some of the things are updated. But for now, that's the end of my rant. You can follow me on Instagram as KWKNR Team Precision Powerlifting Systems.